The May sun cast a warm glow over Washington, D.C. as Donald Trump, freshly sworn in as the 47th President of the United States, prepared to send a message that would leave a lasting impact on America's relationship with West Africa. It was a routine Thursday at the White House. The corridors buzzed with activity. Staffers moved briskly from room to room. Phones rang without pause, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Inside the Oval Office, Trump was flipping through reports focused on the geopolitical developments in the African Sahel region. "Mr. President," said Marcus Wheeler, his advisor on African affairs, adjusting his glasses nervously, "there's an urgent matter in Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré is continuing to expand his influence in the area." Trump raised a hand sharply, cutting him off. His piercing blue eyes remained on the report. "This young man, Ibrahim Traoré, how old is he again?" 36, Mr. President. He came to power in 2022 through a military coup and has since been unfit," Trump interjected, muttering the word just loudly enough for Wheeler to catch it. "Totally unqualified to run a country. Just a soldier pretending to be a president." What Trump didn't anticipate was how quickly those offhand remarks would spread. Within hours, a close aide with media ties leaked the statement. 3 hours later, CNN opened its afternoon broadcast. Breaking news. President Trump labels Burkina Faso's leader inappropriate in private White House meeting. Nearly 8,000 kilometers away, in Burkina Faso's capital, the sun was setting, casting orange hues over the city's French colonial buildings. Inside a heavily guarded modern residence, Ibrahim Traoré was reviewing infrastructure plans. At 36, the captain-turned-president had reshaped not only Burkina Faso, but also the global perception of youthful leadership in Africa. Wearing his signature green military beret and a simple khaki shirt, Traoré was deep in thought when his communications advisor, Amadou Diouf, rushed into the room. "Mr. President," Amadou said, slightly out of breath, "you need to see this right away." He switched on the television and tuned in to France 24. The French anchor, with a grave tone, reported, U.S. President Donald Trump is said to have called the leader of Burkina Faso inadequate. Traoré lifted an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Translate it for me," he said. "Amadou, Trump just called you inappropriate." The news was spreading rapidly across international media. A quiet stillness took over the office. Outside the window, the usual evening sounds of Ouagadougou could be heard: motorcycle horns, street vendors calling out their offers, and faint music playing in the distance. Traoré walked slowly to the window, gazing out over his capital city. Below, everyday life continued. Women balanced baskets on their heads, men pedaled home from work, and children played in the yard of a nearby school. "Inappropriate," he repeated quietly, a faint smile forming at the edge of his lips. "Let's find out who's really inappropriate here." It was Friday morning in Burkina Faso when Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that would catch the world off guard. Instead of responding through conventional diplomatic methods, such as an official statement or back-channel communication, he chose a different path. "Amadou," he said to his aide, "schedule a press conference for 2 p.m. I want every major news outlet present: BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, France 24, and especially our local journalists." "Mr. President, are you sure?" Amadou asked cautiously. A more diplomatic reply might be wiser. Traoré shook his head. "No, Amadou, it's time for some truths to be spoken, and I want it broadcast live." At 2 p.m., the press room in the presidential palace was full. Journalists from across the globe filled rows of white plastic chairs, while cameras pointed at a small podium where the Burkina Faso flag swayed gently in the air-conditioned breeze. Traoré entered right on time, standing tall and composed, his confident presence contrasting with his young age. He took his place behind the microphone, scanning the crowd of reporters before beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," he started, his voice steady and clear across the room. "Yesterday, the President of the United States of America called me inappropriate." A low murmur rippled through the hall as camera shutters clicked repeatedly. I could respond through traditional diplomatic channels. I could issue a formal statement expressing my disapproval. I chose to stand before you today because there's something important that must be said, he began, pausing as his eyes locked on the cameras. If being inadequate means putting the needs of my people ahead of foreign agendas, then yes, I am inadequate. If inadequacy means fighting the corruption draining our nation's lifeblood, then I proudly accept that label. The room fell utterly silent. Even the usual hum of traffic outside seemed to vanish. But if being adequate means handing over our natural resources to benefit outsiders, if adequacy means keeping my people in poverty just to satisfy powerful nations, then I choose to remain inadequate forever. Ibrahim Traoré continued his address. Each word echoed powerfully, not just through the press room, but across the satellite signals broadcasting his message globally. "President Trump," he said, turning directly to the main camera, "you speak of inadequacy. Let me share a story about what adequacy really looks like." He stepped aside from the podium, gesturing casually, as if speaking among friends. "When I became the leader of this nation in 2022, Burkina Faso was ranked among the world's poorest. Our children were starving while foreign corporations mined gold from our land. Our youth had no access to proper education, yet we were burdened with billions in unclear debts." A BBC journalist scribbled frantically, while others captured the moment on their phones. "In just 3 years, we've cut child mortality by 40%. We've constructed more schools than were built in the past decade. Our farmers now grow enough food to nourish our people, and we even export to neighboring nations." Traoré paused, sipping water from a plain glass. "But maybe that seems inappropriate, at least to those used to African leaders who simply smile and agree. Maybe it's considered inappropriate when an African president chooses to say no when it matters." A reporter from Al Jazeera raised her hand, but Traoré signaled that he wasn't done. "Mr. Trump, you govern a nation where children go hungry in schools while billions are spent on wars abroad. You lead a country where people die because health care is too expensive. Your youth are shackled by decades of student debt just to pursue an education." The silence was so profound that even the camera operators froze. "So tell me, Mr. President of the United States, who is truly inadequate?" In the hours after Traoré's speech, social media erupted. Hashtags like "Eu Traoré vs Trump," "Chiu Burkina Faso Truth," and "Inappropriate Leader" quickly went viral. In London, BBC Africa correspondent Sarah Mitchell was in her Kensington apartment when her phone rang with urgency. "Sarah, did you catch Traoré's speech? Watching it now, James. It's impressive. I need you to prepare a full analysis for the 6-hour news. This will be our top story." Meanwhile, in Paris, the Élysée Palace was in a state of high alert. President Emmanuel Macron had summoned an emergency meeting with his advisors on African affairs. Adjusting his navy blue tie, Macron said, "We need to grasp the full impact of what just occurred. Traoré isn't simply replying to Trump. He's reshaping how African leaders present themselves on the global stage." Back in the United States, it was early morning when the speech began circulating across American media. Known for his frequent Twitter activity, Trump was uncharacteristically quiet. At the White House, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was awakened by a flood of calls from reporters demanding an official response. "No comment for now," was all she could offer before hanging up and trying to get some rest, knowing the coming hours would be intense. In Johannesburg, South Africa, Zimbabwean opposition leader Nelson Chamisa posted on social media, "Today, Ibrahim Traoré showed the world that Africa has leaders bold enough to speak truth to power. We're witnessing a historic turning point. In Cairo, Egypt, political commentators were passionately discussing the event on televised panels, analyzing its broader geopolitical significance. "This isn't just about Trump versus Traoré," explained Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a professor of international relations at Cairo University. "It's about a new Africa, one that refuses to be seen as inferior." It was Saturday morning at Mar-a-Lago, Florida, when Donald Trump finally decided to react. The weather was sunny, palm trees swaying in the Atlantic breeze, but inside Trump's private office the atmosphere was tense. Trump sat eating his usual breakfast, scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast, while watching replays of Traoré's speech across multiple news networks. His aides stood nearby, nervous. "This kid," Trump said, chewing a piece of bacon, "this kid thinks he can take me on." Stephen Miller, his senior advisor, cleared his throat. "Mr. President, perhaps it's better to let this fade. Any response might only magnify." "Magnify?" Trump cut in, eyes narrowing. "He embarrassed me in front of the world. No so-called third-world dictator's going to talk to me like that." He stood up suddenly, knocking over his coffee, staining the white tablecloth. "Schedule a press conference for noon. I'll show this Ibrahim who's in charge." At exactly 12 p.m., Trump strode into the White House press briefing room, his typical posture on display. Chest out, chin high, serious face. The press was already assembled, aware something major was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trump began, staring straight into the cameras. "Yesterday, a military leader from a country that most Americans couldn't find on a map dared to criticize me." He paused dramatically, as he often did. Ibrahim Traoré, this inexperienced young man who seized power through a military coup, wants to lecture the United States of America about democracy. Trump gestured broadly, his voice rising. "Burkina Faso is among the poorest and most. Some countries in the world are dangerously unstable. In some, terrorist groups control large parts of the land. People there are forced to flee to nearby nations in search of safety. And yet, one of their leaders wants to lecture me about leadership?" The room fell silent, but the cameras recorded every expression and gesture. Let me make this absolutely clear. The United States does not accept lessons from failed states ruled by military regimes. If Mr. Traoré wants to be part of this global dialogue, he must first demonstrate he can govern his own country effectively. President Trump's statement drew a sharp line on the world stage. It was as if the globe had been split into two, those who stood by the American president and those who supported Ibrahim Traoré's message. In Accra, Ghana, President Nana Akufo-Addo called an emergency meeting of the African Union. The organization's modern headquarters was alive with activity as diplomats from across the continent gathered. "Brothers," President Akufo-Addo said in the closed-door session, "no matter our opinions on President Traoré's approach, we cannot allow African leaders to be insulted like this in the international arena." Soon after, African heads of state began issuing public responses. Nigerian President Bola Tinubu released a statement saying, "Africa demands respect and dignity. We stand with our brother Ibrahim Traoré in defending African sovereignty." Meanwhile, European leaders were placed in a delicate position. During a private phone call between President Macron and the German Chancellor, their concern was clear. "Emmanuel," said the Chancellor, "we must handle this situation with care. We cannot afford to isolate either the Americans or the Africans." "I agree," Macron replied, gazing out over the gardens from his Élysée office. "But Traoré raises an important issue. France must also reconsider its relationship with Africa." Back in Africa, protests began springing up across several capital cities. In Dakar, Senegal, young demonstrators took to the streets with signs that read, "Traoré speaks our truth. Africa is no longer a colony." In Lagos, Nigeria's largest city, students at the University of Lagos held a peaceful rally. Chinelo Okafor, a 22-year-old political science student, spoke through a megaphone. For too long, our leaders have bowed to Western pressure. Today, Ibrahim Traoré reminded us that we can stand with pride. The young crowd erupted in applause, capturing the moment on their phones to share across social platforms. Across the Atlantic, in Latin America, where many nations have faced similar experiences with U.S. intervention, leaders voiced their support. The presidents of Bolivia and Venezuela both made public statements. "What Ibrahim Traoré has done," said the Venezuelan president in a televised speech, "is speak. The truth we've all felt but few dared to say aloud." Then came Tuesday, when everything shifted again. While on a technical visit to a newly constructed school outside Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré received a phone call that would dramatically alter the diplomatic landscape. The school itself was modest but well-maintained, its walls painted a light, welcoming color. Blue-painted wooden desks and a courtyard where children laughed and played during recess set the scene. Traoré was speaking with teachers about the difficulties faced in rural education when Amadou approached quietly. "President," he murmured, "we have an urgent call. It's from the Chinese ambassador." Traoré offered a courteous apology to the Ican teachers and stepped aside to a quieter part of the schoolyard to take the call. "President Traoré," came Ambassador Li Wei's voice, formal yet warm. "We need to speak urgently. We have a proposal that may interest you." "I'm listening. Ambassador, I'd prefer not to go into detail over the phone. Can we meet this afternoon?" 2 hours later, at the presidential palace, Li Wei sat opposite Traoré in a room adorned with traditional African art. The ambassador, a middle-aged man wearing subtle eyeglasses, opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "Mr. President," he began, "my government has been following the discussions between you and President Trump with great interest." Traoré remained composed, nodding for him to go on. "China believes the moment is right for Africa and Asia to strengthen ties. We have a concrete proposal." Li Wei unfolded a detailed document outlining a $2 billion investment in Burkina Faso's infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, and solar energy projects. Traoré scanned the document, absorbing the figures and specifications. "And in return?" he asked, aware that such offers typically came with expectations. "Only a strategic partnership. Burkina Faso would serve as a Chinese logistics hub in West Africa. Nothing that compromises your nation's sovereignty." Traoré closed the file and leaned back in thought. "I'll need time to consider this, Ambassador." "Of course, but I should note, if the agreement is signed, it will be announced simultaneously in Beijing and Ouagadougou tomorrow at 3 p.m. local time." The timing was deliberate, and Li Wei fully understood the potential ramifications such an announcement would have amid ongoing tensions with the United States. Before the official announcement could even be made, news of the potential deal began to leak. On Wednesday morning, U.S. intelligence intercepted Chinese diplomatic messages referencing the proposal. In Washington, the atmosphere in the White House grew tense. President Trump was in a national security briefing when his defense advisor, General Patrick McKenzie, entered the Situation Room, visibly concerned. "Mr. President," McKenzie said, catching his breath, "we have a situation. Intelligence confirms that China is offering Burkina Faso a $2 billion package." Trump paused, mid-note, and looked up. $2 billion? For that small country?" "Yes, sir. But it's not about the money. It's about strategic influence. If China secures a logistics base in West Africa—" "I know what that means," Trump interrupted, slamming his pen onto the table. "Our little disagreement with Traoré just became a matter of national security." Back in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré convened an emergency session with his Council of Ministers. The atmosphere in the room was intense, with ministers vigorously debating the potential deal with China. "Sir," said Economy Minister Fatima Ouedraogo, "this investment could revolutionize our nation. 2 decades of development condensed into 5 years." "But what about our sovereignty?" countered the foreign minister. Moussa Diabate stood firm. "We don't want to replace one form of dependence with another." Traoré had taken in everyone's opinions before responding. "The real issue isn't whether we accept foreign aid," he said. "It's about the conditions attached to it." He rose from his seat and walked over to a world map on the wall. "For years, we've been treated as pieces in a global power struggle. France, the US, now China, all seeking their own interests." He gestured toward Burkina Faso on the map. "But maybe it's time we proved we know how to play this game too." Just then, his phone rang. It was a direct line from Washington. "President Traoré?" The voice on the other end was formal, tense. "This is Jake Sullivan, U.S. National Security Advisor. President Trump would like a word with you." It was noon in Ouagadougou and 6:00 a.m. in Washington. The most pivotal call of the diplomatic standoff had arrived. Ibrahim Traoré stood in his private office, gazing out the window as the city stirred under the morning sun. On the other end of the line, Trump was in the Oval Office, still in pajamas, surrounded by aides roused early for this critical discussion. "President Traoré," Trump began, his voice unusually composed, "we need to talk like adults." "I'm listening, President." "Trump," Traoré replied calmly. "Look, maybe I was wrong to call your actions inappropriate. Maybe I didn't fully grasp what's happening in your country." Traoré raised an eyebrow, surprised by Trump's conciliatory tone. "And maybe," Trump continued, "the U.S. has overlooked its relationship with African nations that are truly striving to advance." "President Trump," Traoré responded, carefully, "I did not seek conflict. I only acted to protect my nation and its people." "I understand, and I respect that," Trump said. There was a moment of silence as he clearly searched for a diplomatic exit from the mess he had stirred. "Let me be frank with you, Ibrahim. May I call you that?" "You may, President." "Ibrahim, I've heard about China's offer. $2 billion is a significant sum, but let me present an alternative." Traoré straightened in his seat, clearly intrigued. "The United States is prepared to invest $3 billion in Burkina Faso over 5 years, targeting infrastructure, education, healthcare, and agriculture. No conditions." "And in return," Traoré asked, "we ask only for a genuine partnership, not dominance, just true collaboration." Traoré walked back to the window, observing the streets of Ouagadougou. Ordinary citizens going about their morning, unaware of the historic call unfolding. "President Trump," he finally said, "your proposal is generous, but you must understand, Burkina Faso is not for sale. Never has been, never will be." "I understand that now," Trump said, his tone surprisingly genuine. "If the U.S. seeks a real alliance with us, it must be grounded in mutual respect, not in competing bids." I couldn't agree more. "Then here's my counteroffer," Traoré said. "Keep your $3 billion. Instead, open your markets to our agricultural goods. Simplify visas for our students. Treat us not as aid recipients, but as equals." A long silence followed. "Ibrahim," Trump finally said, "I think you and I are going to get along just fine." And so, what began as a tense diplomatic clash over a single word, inappropriate, evolved into a new chapter in U.S. West African relations. Not shaped by wealth or dominance, but by something deeper, mutual respect. 3 months later, President Trump would make his first official visit to Burkina Faso, welcomed by cheering crowds in the streets of Ouagadougou, and Ibrahim Traoré would go on to become the first Burkinabe leader to address the U.S. Congress. But that, of course, is a story for another time.